You can't play this without the capo. See, I was the capo king. The Chuck Berry lick, you know.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I invite you to take a seat and prepare yourself, not for a concert, but for a requiem. This is the story of a man who made America fall in love with the gentle ache of his voice, who carried the sound of the open road in every note, and who, at the height of his fame, could not walk down a street without being stopped. A legend whose name was stitched into the very fabric of country music. His smile lit up television screens. His guitar was his sword, his voice, his crown. But what happens when the crown begins to slip? What happens when the man who once sang Wichita Lineman to roaring applause looks out into the audience only to forget why he's even there? What happens when the songs, his songs, become strangers? This is not just a tale of glory. This is the haunting descent of Glen Campbell, a man who, in the twilight of his life, battled an enemy no fame could silence, his own fading memory. And in the cruelest twist of fate, he began to forget the very music that made him immortal. Ladies and gentlemen, before the memory faded, before the lights dimmed on that unforgettable voice, Glen Campbell was not just a star. He was the golden boy of American country music. Born in the small town of Billstown, Arkansas in 1936, Glen Travis Campbell grew up in a house without electricity or running water. He was one of 12 children, and his only escape from the weight of poverty was music. By the time he was a teenager, Glen had taught himself to play the guitar with such precision that seasoned musicians would stop and listen, dumbfounded. That talent didn't go unnoticed. By the late 1950s, Campbell had made his way to Los Angeles and became a member of the legendary session group known as the Wrecking Crew, a hidden army of elite studio musicians who played on hits from everyone from Elvis Presley to Frank Sinatra. Glen's guitar can be heard on the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations, the Righteous Brothers' You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', and countless others. He wasn't just in the room, he was the room. But it wasn't enough to be the man behind the curtain. Campbell had a voice, clear, emotive, instantly recognizable, and soon the spotlight turned toward him. His solo career exploded in the late 1960s with a string of hits that still echo across time. By the Time I Get to Phoenix, Galveston, Wichita Lineman, songs that captured the ache of distance, the longing of working men, and the poetry of everyday life. He wasn't just singing songs, he was telling America's story. In 1969, Campbell became a household name with the Glen Campbell Good Time Hour on CBS, a variety show that brought country charm into American living rooms. With his boyish smile, Southern manners, and crossover appeal, Glen transcended genre. He wasn't just country, he was culture. The world saw a man who had it all: fame, talent, fortune. He toured with Elvis Presley, performed at the White House, and even co-starred with John Wayne in True Grit, earning a Golden Globe nomination in the process. His records went gold and platinum. His concerts sold out in minutes. Women adored him. Men admired him. Children wanted to be him. To the public, Glen Campbell was the American dream in boots and rhinestones. But as we often find, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. While fans saw a man wrapped in success, Few knew the personal storms that brewed behind his blue eyes. Multiple divorces, battles with substance abuse, a career that rose like a phoenix but teetered precariously on the edge of collapse more than once. He smiled through it all. On stage, he was flawless. On television, he was charming. But behind closed doors, he was slipping, one memory at a time. Ladies and gentlemen, Glen Campbell didn't just write songs that touched the soul. He lived a life that would one day become a song itself, one not of triumph, but of tragic beauty. Ladies and gentlemen, every shining figure on stage carries a shadow behind the curtain. For Glen Campbell, that shadow followed him long before his memory began to fade. At the peak of his fame, Campbell's smile never cracked on camera. But off-screen, his personal life was in turmoil. The pressures of stardom, relentless touring, and a mounting dependence on alcohol and cocaine began to take their toll. What started as casual indulgence soon spiraled into chaos. His charm, once disarming, turned volatile. His presence, once steady, became unpredictable. He was married 4 times, and with each new love came new hope, only to end in heartbreak. His third marriage, to Sarah Barg, who had previously been married to fellow country star Mac Davis, crumbled within 2 years. Their son Dylan was caught in the crossfire of legal battles and bitter separation. Friends recall Campbell as a man tormented by loneliness, even as thousands screamed his name. And then came Tanya Tucker. Their relationship began in 1980, when Campbell was 44 and Tanya just 21. She was a country prodigy, wild and fiery. He was a seasoned star, weary and wounded. Together, they were explosive. The tabloids couldn't get enough of them. Glen and Tanya were photographed everywhere, hugging, fighting, making up, tearing down. Their love was passionate, yes, but also painfully destructive. For Campbell, the fallout was immense. Public perception began to shift. Fans were confused. Was this the same wholesome man who once sang lullabies into their living rooms? The press painted him as a fallen idol. Radio stations quietly pulled his newer tracks. Nashville, once his kingdom, began to look away. And still he kept going.
But even the strongest performers have their breaking point. Campbell's addiction worsened. His concerts grew erratic. His voice, though still golden, began to crack, not from age, but from exhaustion. One night he would be brilliant, the next nearly incoherent. Bandmates would whisper backstage, wondering if this would be the night the show collapsed entirely. But through all the noise, Glen still yearned for something steady, redemption, stability, a place where the applause wasn't followed by silence. In 1981, he met Kim Woolen, a Radio City Music Hall dancer turned waitress. She was calm, grounded, the opposite of the chaos that had consumed him. They married in 1982, and for the first time in years, Glen found a quiet kind of joy. Kim stood by him through relapses and rehab, raising their 3 children with unwavering resolve. Glen tried to change. He wanted to be better, for her, for them. But the damage lingered. Decades of substance abuse don't just fade with vows or prayers. And deep inside Glen's mind, something darker had already begun to stir. He forgot things, first small, then terrifyingly significant. He'd walk into a room and forget why. He'd repeat the same story twice in an hour. At first, it seemed like aging, but it was more. It was the prelude to a silence far more devastating than any career slump or broken love. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. You're standing center stage. The lights are warm. The audience is waiting. The band cues the opening chords of a song you've sung 1,000 times before, and yet your mind is a blank page. You don't remember the words. You don't even remember why you're holding the microphone. For Glen Campbell, that nightmare became reality. In June 2011, the world was stunned when Glen publicly revealed he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a cruel and relentless thief of memory. It was rare for a celebrity of his magnitude to confront such a personal battle so openly. But Glen, he didn't just confront it, he turned it into a final act of courage. Rather than retreat in shame or silence, he embarked on a farewell tour, accompanied by his wife Kim and his children, who formed his backup band. Over 150,000 people came to see him one last time. What they witnessed was both inspiring and heart-wrenching. Some nights Glen was radiant. He joked with the crowd, played flawless guitar solos, sang with a soul untouched by disease. Other nights he forgot lyrics mid-song, asked his daughter what city they were in, or froze under the stage lights. His children would gently guide him. Kim would whisper reminders in his ear. And the audience, they wept, not from disappointment, but from awe. He was still trying, still fighting. During a 2012 interview, Kim said, "He knows who I am, most of the time. But sometimes I'll walk into the room and he looks straight through me, and that breaks me." In the documentary Glen Campbell, I'll Be Me, a scene shows Glen looking into the mirror and muttering, "I'm not sure who I'm looking at." That raw vulnerability, filmed, exposed, and shared with the world, was more powerful than any platinum record. He was showing us what it meant to lose yourself slowly, piece by painful piece. Yet amid that darkness, something remarkable happened. Glen recorded one final album, Ghost on the Canvas. He sang like a man saying goodbye not just to his audience, but to his own mind. The title track echoes with quiet sorrow. I know a place between life and death for you and me. Critics called it his musical will. Fans called it devastatingly beautiful. Still, the disease marched on. In 2014, Glen was moved into a long-term care facility. The man who once performed for presidents could no longer remember his children's names. He stopped playing guitar, then speaking. And yet, sometimes even in the thickest fog of dementia, his fingers would twitch as if reaching for chords only his soul remembered. Friends and collaborators shared stories that chilled the heart. One recalled visiting Glen and playing Rhinestone Cowboy. Glen didn't react until the chorus. Then, like a ghost rising from deep within, he softly sang, "Like a rhinestone cowboy." And just like that, he faded again. He wasn't gone, not entirely, not yet. The world watched helplessly as the man who gave voice to America's dreams slowly fell silent. And still his family remained at his side. His wife, Kim, his children, his bandmates, all holding on to every flicker of recognition, every smile, every half-remembered note. Ladies and gentlemen, in the final chapters of Glen Campbell's life, there were no encores, no glittering stages, no standing ovations. There was only quiet. By 2016, Glen could no longer speak. The disease had taken away his words, his thoughts, his sense of time. And yet, in that silence, something extraordinary remained: the love of his family. His wife, Kim, never left his side. Through the chaos of fame, the despair of addiction, and now the cruel twilight of Alzheimer's, she held him, sometimes literally, sometimes with nothing more than a whispered word or a shared tear. She later said, "It was heartbreaking, but it was also the most intimate love we had ever known. His children, Ashley, Shannon, Cal, became not just caretakers but torchbearers of his legacy. Ashley in particular stood out. A talented musician herself, she toured with Glen during his farewell concerts. Night after night, she watched her father forget where he was, but never forgot who he was. In interviews, she spoke not with bitterness, but reverence. "I got to say goodbye in the most beautiful way," she once said, "on stage with a guitar."
Glen Campbell passed away on August 8, 2017, in Nashville, Tennessee, surrounded by family. He was 81 years old. And though his final years were marked by pain, they were also filled with grace. In the days following his death, tributes poured in, not just from musicians, but from people across generations. Keith Urban called him a true guitar god. Dolly Parton said Glen was one of the greatest voices of all time. Even President Bill Clinton issued a statement of mourning. But perhaps the most touching tribute came not in words, but in silence. In that quiet space, we remembered him not as the man lost in confusion, but as the boy from Arkansas who rose to become America's rhinestone cowboy, who laughed on TV sets, wept through heartbreak, clawed his way back from ruin, and faced his own fading with more courage than most could imagine. Ladies and gentlemen, Glen Campbell's final song was not played on radio. It was not written in Nashville. It was etched in the hearts of those who watched him disappear and loved him all the same. After all, when the music stops, what remains? Family, love, and the echo of a voice we will never forget. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have walked through the rise, the fall, and the quiet fade of a legend. But what does it mean, truly, to watch someone you love vanish in slow motion? To witness a man who once commanded stadiums now stare blankly through the people who love him most, and still to stand by him. Kim Campbell did, his children did, and millions of fans, perhaps unknowingly, did too, each time they pressed play on a song he no longer remembered singing. So I ask you, is that not the purest form of love? To hold on to someone when even they have let go? Was Glen Campbell's greatest legacy not the music, not the awards, not the Hollywood stardom, but the brutal honesty with which he let us see his final chapter? Ladies and gentlemen, when the curtain closes and memory fades, what do we have left? Do we cling to what once was, or do we find meaning in the fragments that remain? Tonight, Glen's story leaves us not with a melody, but with a question. Is it possible to be forgotten and still be unforgettable? This was not just the fall of a star. It was the slow surrender of a soul and the quiet, stubborn beauty of those who refused to let him disappear without love. Good night, dear audience. Hold your loved ones close, because one day the song may end, but the echo, if we choose to hear it, can last forever.